It is my pleasure to welcome Alessandra from the University of Witwatersrand in South Africa. Can I pronounce it? She was meant to be enjoying this wonderful spring weather with us in Cambridge as part of a collaborative grant from the Cambridge Africa Alberada Research Fund. Unfortunately, for obvious reasons, this was not to be, and Alessandra kindly agreed to give her seminar talk via Zoom. Alessandra is an Associate Director and Researcher at the SAMRC WIT's Developmental Pathways for Health Research Unit, and she obtained her PhD in exercise physiology in 2014. And subsequently, during her postdoc fellowship, she developed her research area in maternal and child health, specifically the effect of movement behaviours, physical activity, sedentary behaviour and sleep on infant growth, development and well-being. And Alessandra's developed methods for measuring movement in infants, which is no mean feat. She was instrumental in designing and testing a wearable band using accelerometry to objectively measure movements in infants as young as 3 months old. And we have great pleasure that she has been collaborating with the unit since 2015, and the collaboration has expanded across projects and the unit. So Alessandra is particularly interested in how the caregiving environment can influence infant movement and early childhood development. And we look forward to hearing more about this today. Over to Alessandra.
Thank you, Kirsten. I guess I should put my video on so you guys can see who I am. So yeah, thanks for the introduction and for allowing me to give my presentation, even though I couldn't be there in person. Let me just get this presentation started for you. Okay, so I'm going to discuss with you sort of the journey that I've taken since my postdoc in, as Kirsten said, measuring movement behaviors in the first 2 years of life, and then where it's led me to in terms of looking at how the caregiving environment is impacting movement behaviors. So I'll start off with movement behaviors in general. And much like the UK and other countries globally, and now the WHO, South Africa has developed movement guidelines for the early years, so for 0 to 5-year-olds. And these guidelines fall very much in line with the other guidelines that are recommended internationally. My focus period is really on the 0 to 2-year-olds because there's a lot more work that's being done in the 3, 4, and 5-year-olds, the preschool period. But the 0 to 2-year-olds generally tend to get ignored in terms of movement behaviors, largely because of the difficulty in measuring these behaviors. And also because up until recently, I think there wasn't really the sense that it was so important in that period, or that it was something that we could change. So now we have a bit more information around the importance of movement behaviors in the early years. And the recommendations state that babies should be moving for about 30 minutes a day. And this includes tummy time. And if they are crawling, then it includes crawling. No TV time is recommended. Any sort of sitting or restraint time should be limited. And there are recommendations for how long they should be sleeping, which includes nap times. And then the 1 to 2-year-olds, we start incorporating a little bit more active play. So they should be kind of playing, moving quite sort of actively or vigorously for about 3 hours. Also, any sitting time or restraint time should be limited. And up to 2 years, they should also not be having any screen time. So these are the recommendations that I'll be focusing on. And the goal initially, when I started my postdoc in this work, was just to try and measure infant movement. These guidelines hadn't been developed yet, at least in South Africa. And then consequently, we were able to sort of measure whether children were adhering to the guidelines. But initially, it was just about measuring these movement behaviors. So firstly, I started off by doing some sort of measurement with maternal reported data. So mums in Soweto in South Africa, which is where we work, it's a semi-urban township area, quite impoverished in most cases, very densely populated. sort of poor access to health facilities in a lot of cases. So that's the population that I work in. And mums were reporting how much time their infants, so I'm calling them all infants, but they are infants and toddlers, 0 to 2-year-olds. So how much time they spent doing certain activities, and then we kind of grouped that together to see whether they were meeting the guidelines or not according to that maternal reported data. And what we found is that 53% of our infants met one guideline, 10% met two, and 37% met none of the guidelines. And none of the children met all of the guidelines. So these 24-hour movement guidelines are meant to be seen together. You're meant to be meeting all of the guidelines in order to have the kind of most optimal movement behaviors. If we look more specifically on the graph on the right-hand side, you can see that the majority of children were not meeting the sleep guidelines and the sedentary or screen time guidelines. So that's kind of what drove these numbers down. So screen time was really high in this population from 3 months old. When we looked at some associations with what this meant for the population and kind of whether there were any correlations with other outcomes such as adiposity, we found that meeting the physical activity guidelines was associated with higher subcutaneous adipose fat, which is beneficial in this kind of growing period, but not with BMI. We found that males met more guidelines than females, so this was quite, and were also more likely to meet the physical activity guidelines, so showing kind of sexual differentiation even from 3 months old. Infant tummy time was ranged from 2 to 30 minutes, but on average was only 15 minutes, so they're not meeting that 30-minute tummy time guideline. And toddler activity was generally okay, so about 150 minutes a day, so just below the guideline. Only 2% met the sedentary time guideline, and this was mainly due to screen time. Time restrained was really high, and screen time was on average 30 minutes a day, bearing in mind that these children are not meant to be having any screen time. Meeting the sleep guideline was associated also with higher subcutaneous fat, but not with BMI. So similar findings to physical activity. So sleep and physical activity showing beneficial effects, not on increasing BMI, but on sort of adequate fat deposition. So then moving on to looking at these behaviors objectively, just to outline some of the difficulties with assessing physical activity objectively. So infant activities are sporadic. They don't occur in bouts like adult activity. So there's very short bursts of movement, which are obviously quite difficult to measure because they're not happening in a continuum. Infants are also having regular naps, which interferes with our data because that's you can't just extract sleep time like you would with an adult. You've got these naps occurring throughout the day. Subjective measures are likely to miss all of this because as much as parents might be aware of what's going on, they don't know exactly when their child has fallen asleep or not, or exactly the range of movement they were doing throughout the day. There's not great consensus between accelerometer placement and wear time. There's no cut points, so there's no sedentary, light, moderate, and vigorous cut points for infant movement. So bearing in mind that these cut points are not necessarily the best route to go even for adult movement, but it does give you a way to kind of classify behaviors and compare to other populations, but we can't do this with infants yet. And then the big kind of obvious one is that infants are often being carried by their caregivers, and these caregiver movement behaviors are likely to influence the infant data. And one study has shown that this is about 55% of the infant data is influenced by caregiver movement. And then also the devices that are being used in adult populations haven't necessarily tested the feasibility in infant populations. So the work I started doing with Cambridge was with the physical activity group, and we initially were trying to design a wristband that could fit the activity monitor. So this monitor shown in this picture is an accelerometer that measures physical activity, will change in movement, which we can then from that extrapolate physical activity. And we wanted to find a way to use this device for infants that could be worn over a period of about a week. And it obviously needed to be feasible and acceptable. So we went through a range of testing of these bands and trying to figure out the best kind of way of fitting them. And ultimately came up with a design which we then piloted both in Cambridge and in South Africa. There were certain issues that were brought to our attention by the mothers, which we then took into account and incorporated in the design of the new band, which is available under Creative Commons and is now available for purchase as well. So this is what the new band looks like. And it fits this little accelerometer with a kind of overlocking folding mechanism that keeps the accelerometer in place. And this was obviously designed to be safe for infant wear, so this monitor can't come out. It's meant to be secure, so all the little stud presses keep it secure. The material is hygienic and also water resistant. So there were lots of things that were taken into account. And this work was done in collaboration with Open Labs in Newcastle. So with this, we were then able to start measuring physical activity objectively in this infant population. And so what I'm showing you now is a series of graphs which show you the average acceleration that was accumulated across the day, so for different hours of the day. So first to notice in this graph is you can see a kind of diurnal pattern of behavior where there's two peaks with a little lull in between, which is quite a normal sort of pattern of behavior that we see in human populations. But it was quite evident that males were more physically active than females. So even from 3 months, which was the youngest infant we had, they were accumulating high intensities of physical activity on an hourly basis. We then also looked at the different age groups and saw that as age increased, so did intensity of physical activity, which would make sense. But generally that sort of pattern of behavior remained relatively the same, except for in the babies, so the 3 month or around 3 month infants who had kind of a more plateaued curve, presumably with lots of kind of nap times and short wakings. We then looked at developmental status and tried to see whether there were any differences according to attainment of motor milestones. And we saw that there were differences whereby the infants who were not mobile were obviously accumulating less intense activity, and those that were crawling and walking were accumulating more intense activity. And those two graphs kind of overlapped, and in some periods of the day the crawlers were more active than the walkers, and other periods of the day it was different. I think that a lot of the differentiation that we see with the kind of crawlers and walkers is going to have to do with the placement of the accelerometer. We had the accelerometer on the wrist. So we did a literature review to see kind of from previous research where the best placement would be. And obviously the wrist is going to be used a lot in crawling and maybe less so in walking. Then moving on to sort of looking at this male and female differentiation a little bit more. This graph is showing you on the left the average minutes per day of different intensities of activity, and on the bottom is showing you the intensities. So if we look at a continuous spectrum of physical activity from 0 to kind of maximum intensity of activity, this is showing you how many minutes per day the infant spent in each intensity threshold. You can see that there's not a lot of activity accumulated towards the right-hand side. So what I did is, so the left is low intensity, right is high intensity. What I did was just blow out a certain portion of the kind of higher intensity activity up till about 500 mgs, because there was not really much activity accumulated after that. And if you blow out that graph and just look at the high intensity spectrum, you can see again that males were accumulating more high intensity physical activity than females. So this again just shows that males were definitely more active in this population. Then lastly, looking at some associations between these physical activity levels and BMI. And we did this for BMI. We also did this for subcutaneous and visceral fats. But just to show you the BMI graph, what we found is that there's almost this U-shaped relationship between physical activity and BMI, whereby the normal weight infants were accumulating the most physical activity, and then underweight or overweight infants were accumulating less. Obviously, the study was cross-sectional, so we don't really know the direction of the relationship, but there definitely is some kind of relationship there. If we then look at that activity on a kind of in a linear or non-linear sort of graph, looking at the underweight, normal weight, and overweight groups, and these were corrected for age, these were corrected for age and for sex. And you can see here that again, there is kind of differentiation between the underweight, normal weight, and overweight groups. Okay, so then moving on to the caregiver-infant interactions. So we know from various work that's been done, not necessarily so much in the physical activity field, but more in kind of psychology and other fields, that behaviors in the early childhood period, movement included, is likely going to be dependent on the opportunities provided by caregivers. So while there might be some element of autonomy in infant movement, more so as they get older, if they don't have the opportunities to be active or the resources or the environment, then it's going to be, their autonomy is limited. So in those first 2 years, it's really dependent on caregivers. And then as they get older, there's other factors that start to influence that relationship, such as role modeling, joint participation in activity, the home environment, and in some cases, genetics. But we don't really know in the first 2 years of life exactly what the relationship between caregiver and infant movement is. There's a lot of factors that can confound this relationship, such as whether there are other children in the home, whether the mom is employed or not, so whether she's actually with her infant or not. And we've seen that there are diurnal changes, so the time of day is going to have an impact. So what we did is put accelerometers on mothers and infants at the same time, so that we could see in a 1 week period what was going on with their physical activity and kind of look at the two together. And so this graph is showing you the average intensity of physical activity over a 24-hour period. What we also did here was separate out periods when the mother was, so when we call her the caregiver or not the caregiver. So if she was physically with the infant at the time or if she wasn't. And what we found is that in both cases, both mother and infant were more active when they weren't together than when they were together. But if the mother was being active when she was with her infant, then the infant's activity was higher. And so there was an interaction between the mother's physical activity and the infant's physical activity. And this relationship was different when they were together or not. Just to show you kind of a more raw form of this data, where the mom is in blue and the child is in red, you can just see over, these are different days, that the activity was quite in line in a lot of instances. So they're kind of following the same peaks and lulls in activity. And as I showed you earlier, there is sort of a natural diurnal pattern of activity, which may be the reason why these graphs are so similar. But there could also be other reasons. It may be that their behaviors are linked. It may be that it's because the mother's carrying the child. And obviously all of this is dependent on various factors, such as like I said, if they are together or not, the age of the child, and various other things. But the relationships that we showed in this previous graph accounted for all of that, and yet we still saw this strong relationship between mother and child activity. So what we decided next is that we need to understand what's going on in this caregiving environment. We need to know what mothers and infants are doing when they are together. What is it that's making them both less active when they are together? And what are the mothers doing when they are being active with their children? Because in order to try and intervene in these settings, we obviously need to understand what's happening. And accelerometers give us really detailed movement data, but they don't really give us a good understanding of context, or they give us no understanding really of context. So for this work, I collaborated with Bristol University, with a group there, and they've been developing a means to measure parenting. So they're a psychology group, and they are more interested in understanding parenting and how it relates to mental health transmission. And they've been using these little head cameras. So they're actually spy cams that you can buy online. And so these little smiley faces are the head cams, and they're worn on a headband on both the caregiver and the child at the same time, so that you get this first person observation data. At the same time, in the bottom right corner, you can see there's a photo frame, which is also a spy cam. And so that photo frame will capture the whole interaction from a kind of third person perspective. And this data is coded on a second by second basis, and every single behavior that is done in that second is coded. So whether there's touch, what is being touched, is there movement, what is the facial expression, is there speech, what is the speech, both from the mother and the child's perspective. So the goal was to try and see if we could use this tool in South Africa in our context. Obviously the Bristol context is very different from Soweto. Bristol, the LSPAC cohort, has a really good sort of participant base that they can work from, with really kind of consistent participants, whereas we would be collecting data in the field, and we basically just needed to see whether this tool would work. So here you can see an example of our setting. Mama and baby are wearing the head cams at the same time. So they are each capturing each other's perspective, and then this picture is taken from the third person camera. So, I mean, initially what is striking is the context. So in most cases, and I've done a lot of sort of environmental, I wouldn't call it environmental mapping specifically, but just work to kind of understand the context of the Soweto environment within which children live. And we did that using door-to-door surveys of about 30,000 homes. So we have a lot of data, and these populations, the houses are very densely populated. So often the house consists of one room or maybe two, within which the entire family lives. So the bedroom is also the kitchen and the bathroom, and kind of the eating area and the TV room. So everything happens all in this one room. So that's kind of the first striking difference in how these interactions happen. The second thing is that because of these space constraints, and maybe because of cultural reasons as well, activities and interactions don't happen at a distance like they do in Bristol, whereby the child would be sitting in a high chair and the mother would be interacting from across the table or nearby. In our setting, the mums and the babies are on top of each other and interacting very physically. So that was difficult in terms of the footage quality that we could capture, because there was no stillness and face-to-face interaction. There was like a lot of movement and kind of distorted vision. So it was quite hard to see. And we had to use these third-person cameras quite a lot for coding of the data, because the first-person camera is quite difficult to code. I have videos of these that I wanted to show, but because I don't have permission for them to be shared, I'm not showing the actual videos. This is just an image that was captured by a baby walking around wearing the head camera. So their mom is with them and they're playing outdoors. But I just thought it just to give you some context of the home, what the home looks like and what kind of an outdoor area looks like. And these outdoor areas are not necessarily, well, basically not safe. Mothers have reported a lot of the reason why they don't let their children play outside is because of safety. So things like outdoor toilets, which are shared amongst multiple community members and aren't locked. One of the big concerns was children falling into the toilet if they were left to play outside. But then there's also serious fears of kind of rape and abduction. And these areas are not fenced off. The road would be right alongside the houses, so the kids can just get straight into the road if they're let outside. So these kids are often kept indoors for safety means, and so the moms do try and play and interact, but it's in a very different way to what you would see in a high income setting. So some of our findings from the piloting of this tool was, on the positive side, most of the mothers enjoyed using the cameras. They all said that they would wear them again, and were very interested in viewing their own footage, which I think is quite a helpful sort of intervention tool that we can try and incorporate going forward. A lot of the concerns internationally with other groups that have started using these tools is concerns about breaches in privacy or how their data is going to be used. And our moms didn't seem to worry too much about that. They kind of took what we said and were okay with it. They were happy with the instructions that we gave them. They were happy to use the cameras, and they didn't worry about other family members being captured in the footage. Whereas in other settings, like in Bristol, if another family member is captured in the footage by mistake, they often will then, they have the option to delete that footage so that the researchers never see it. We gave our mothers the same options, but they didn't take them. And in fact, they found that the other family members enjoyed being in the footage and wanted to kind of jump into the camera and be on video. The negative sides with it, because these are little spy cameras and not used necessarily for this, they don't show you when they're on or off. So it's quite difficult to know if you've set it up correctly. And if you haven't, then obviously you've lost all that potential footage. Some of the moms found it difficult to keep the headbands on the babies because they wanted to play with them and take them off. And so the acceptability was higher in the younger infants because they had kind of less autonomy over trying to remove the headband. And moms also reported that they really enjoyed the kind of third person perspective where they could just switch on the camera and let it film them, and would be happy to kind of do that throughout the day and just have the whole day filmed. Whereas with these head cameras, we have very short periods. So they film for about 5 to 15 minutes of interaction. Consequently to this, we have worked, so myself and the group in Bristol, and then other sites internationally that have started trying to use these tools, have worked together on now coming up with a new design and designing our own headcam that kind of meets all of our requirements. And that's actually, that headcam is being designed now. So all of these things that we found that were difficult have been taken into account, and going forward we have a much better quality headcam, which also addresses a lot of the issues. So that process was done and has resulted in us having a better tool. And then lastly, I just wanted to show you some of the data that comes from this headcam. So you can see what this is showing you is the coding just for touch with the right hand of the caregiver. So this would be done for every single behavior that could possibly happen. So it's extensive coding, it takes a really, really long time. It has been developed in a way that means that not necessarily a lay person, but it doesn't require too much training to be able to code accurately, because there are so many different levels of coding that it's almost hard to get it wrong. And we did go through a process of developing a coding tool that was South Africa specific. So working with our data and with the Bristol team and doing kind of what we call coding boot camps, we worked on developing a coding framework that worked for our context. So basically adapting their framework. So this is what the data would look like. You can see when there's lines of code that those activities were happening, and sometimes they go on for a few seconds before they stop. So that's when you would see kind of a solid block. And just as an initial kind of comparison between the UK population in Bristol and our population, one of the things that we found quite noticeable is that there's much more touch in our population, which is the graph above, and then the graph below. So if you compare the two green sort of blocks, there's much less touch in the UK population. So that was just a preliminary thing. We are still working on fixing, well, on continuing to code this data and to publish it. But my goal going forward now, and I have various kind of grant applications underway to try and get this moving, is to combine the physical activity data with this headcam data. So this is just an imaginary kind of output from the headcam above and from the accelerometer below. And my thinking is that if we can understand how these caregiving behaviors are relating to physical activities, so firstly understanding, is different styles of caregiving and different types of behaviors, do they predict more or less activity? And then also trying to understand whether there's certain behaviors that precede bouts of activity or less activity, and trying to use that in order to intervene in this context, and to intervene in a way that's kind of contextually friendly, and that we can develop some types of ways of teaching mothers about nurturing care and about movement behaviors, and giving them things that they can do within their context that works, so that they can improve their infants' physical activity levels and consequently have all the knock-on effects of improved growth, development, emotional, cognitive well-being. So this is the goal, and this is what we are in the process of working on in South Africa, and then also trying to kind of replicate this in the LSPAC cohort as well, so that we can have some comparative data. So that is it, just a summary of the work I'm doing. Obviously, I'd like to thank the funders that have been involved this far, and if you do have any extra questions besides the ones that I answer now, then please feel free to contact me. Thank you.